Good morning. I welcome all of you to Psalm 20, and I'm going to slow it down, I hope, a little bit today. I felt like I packed in a lot yesterday. Psalm 19 is so rich. Aviva, what a treat to see Aviva here, to see joining us. So Psalm 20. What I'm finding remarkable as I have this privilege to prepare these Psalms closely is so far how distinctive every Psalm is. Psalm 20 is a prayer, and the refrain in the first 6 verses of its 10 is May. In a moment, I'm going to sing to you another song that begins with May. But I want to say this Psalm also looked at closely is remarkable for the attention to detail. In this case, the psalm is composed of 70 words. 70 in the Jewish tradition is a number of wholeness, as 7 is whole, 70 is whole. And the Zohar will say that this represents the 70 nations who are composed of the world, suggesting also Israel's dangers in the world. And it will also add, the Zohar, that there are 70 cries of a woman in labor. And perhaps because of that comment of the Zohar, linking 70 with tears. And in this case, because this is a prayer for another person's needs, this Psalm 20 became popularized as a psalm for a woman unable to bear children or a woman in labor. So it became identified as a woman's psalm. Though in its own context, this psalm is written for the king, apparently King David, as many. But as we look at the psalm closely, we'll see this shifting and uncertainty of who is in the first 5 verses, who is the you being prayed for, and who's doing the praying. So may Adonai answer you. Who's saying that and who's the you? And then you'll see in verse 6 and verses 8 and 9, it speaks about may we. May we. And then verse 7, which is a hinge verse, it's now I know. We'll return to some of these constructions, but I highlight even before I begin that there is this shifting throughout between you, I, we, which is worthy of analysis. And the last line depends on punctuation. Adonai Hoshia HaMelech, Ya'anenu V'yom Karenu, which, by the way, is the second line said every night in our Ma'ariv prayers. This concluding line, verse 10, Adonai delivers. May the Supreme Guide answer us on the day that we call. But if it's punctuated a different way, which is how it is in the Vulgate, the Latin translation, which is the major Roman Catholic translation for the Bible, it's may God save the king, which would later enter into the English expression. Well, we'll return to that, and we'll return to how verse 10, the last line, and verse 2 are the envelope. But before we begin, I'm going to sing to you a little bit of Bob Dylan, and then I'll tell you why. This is from Forever Young. May God bless and keep you always. May your wishes all come true. May you always do for others and let others do for you. May you build a ladder to the stars and climb on every rung. May you stay forever young. May you grow up to be righteous. May you grow up to be true. May you always know the truth and see the light surrounding you. May you always be courageous, stand upright, and be strong. May you stay forever young. Now there's more to it. And when I do Dylan, he was the main guy I listened to in high school, so I hear his voice. Bottom line, I sing it as a secular prayer. This notion, and you'll see how these lines, may you grow up to be righteous, may you grow up to be true, may you always know the truth, may the light surrounding you will be reflected in this psalm or in a lot of the psalms. But what's distinctive about Psalm 20 compared to any of the psalms we have read to this point is this expression of may God. It's a yearning of expression. Well, let me read the psalm and then I'll come back and analyze a little bit of its artistry in terms of the weave and some of the commentaries about who is saying this psalm to whom. And then pull it together, pacing myself so we have time today to reflect. I have actually changed this psalm as recently as 15 minutes ago. Eric's used to having me constantly tweak, and I'll say a word about that tweaking. In the translation that I do, I look at many translations and then make choices. And in doing so, I try to keep God as without a male pronoun. So if it's he, which occurs in Hebrew, you'll see God in brackets so that I don't have to, for our English ears, constantly refer to God as a male. And some translations try to make the English feel lyrical. I try to do it closer to the Hebrew phrasing, because in the Hebrew, it's often very purposeful how the sentences are put together. So with that, Psalm 20, supplication for aid. For the conductor, a psalm of David. May Adonai answer you in a day of distress, make you safe, the name of the God of Jacob. May God send you help from the sanctuary and from Zion support you. May God remember all your grain offerings and your burnt offerings as generous. Selah. May God grant you your heart's desires and your every plan fulfill. May we sing joyfully over your deliverance, and in the name of our God lift up our banners. May Adonai fulfill all your requests. Now I know that Adonai has delivered God's anointed one, answered him from God's holy heavens with the mighty deliverance of God's right hand. They on chariots and they on horses, but we, the name of Adonai our God, will invoke. They have bent down and fallen, but we arise and stand firmly. Adonai deliver, the royal, answer us on the day that we call. So compared to some of the other Psalms, kind of an average length, some analysis to share with you. The word you appears repeatedly in this psalm. It's may Adonai answer you, make you safe, send you help, sustain you from Zion. So over and over, particularly in the first 5 verses, which raises the question, who is speaking? Now, Rashi, the classic Bible commentator of the 11th century, he says this is all written by King David. But many other traditional commentators say this was written by a musician, a member of the Levitical choir in honor of David. And that when it shifts to verse 6, it's the writer of the psalm, this musician, saying now to the choir, may we sing joyfully over your deliverance, meaning over the king's deliverance, and the name of our God lift up our banners. May Adonai fulfill all your counsels or your requests. And so that's the majority of commentators see this as not by David, but on behalf of the king, whether it's David or another ruler. And then this verse 7, where it shifts to, now I know that Adonai has delivered God's anointed one. That's why we know it's about a king. To be Mashiach, Mishicho, Messiah, verse 7, Mishicho, his anointed one, is to be empowered. And the way that a king was empowered is with oil being poured on them. His answered him. And therefore I chose in this case to put the hymn because it's about a king of another time. And then a shift with verse 8 to now going back, as did verse 6, to describing a faith in God, but now in the plural. They on chariots and they on horses, whoever are these enemies that verse 7 refers to having been saved from. Consistently, all the more in David's life, there is always the threat of physical enemies. And so these enemies are now described. They on chariots and they on horses. It's elliptical. That they put their trust, they see their might, their capacity for victory in chariots and horses. But we know that it's the name of Adonai who we invoke, meaning our strength is the trust in Adonai. And so when they bow down, they fall. But we're able to arise, we stand and stand firmly. And now again, looking at verse 10. Here's the question. In the very beginning, it says regarding the king that he's a king who's in distress, or a person in distress. Here in the closing line is where punctuation matters. Yud He Vav He, Hoshea, God saves or delivers. HaMelech, the king, Ya'anenu v'yom karenu, will answer us in the day that we call. Now, the Masoretes, which means the rabbis of the early Middle Ages, 8th, 9th century, put trup, musical notations in all of Scripture. And for the word Hoshea, the second word of verse 10, they used what's called an etnachta, which meant for them it was the end of a phrase. And so Ibn Ezra, an important commentator of Spain, will say that there are some who would translate this as Adonai delivers the king, comma, let him answer us in the day that we call. But because of the Masoretes' vowels of musical notation, that's incorrect, Ibn Ezra would say, and then most traditional commentators will follow. And so it will be translated as Adonai delivers, full stop. And then HaMelech, the king, doesn't refer to King David because it's HaMelech, the king. That's usually the name given to God. It's then comma, may the supreme king, or I prefer for a more colloquial translation, Melech in Hebrew, the word king has the same root as guide. Lahamlich is to cause to go forward, because the role of a king is to give guidance. Laws likewise are halacha, the way. And so may the supreme guide answer us on the day that we call. Some other things just to know about in terms of the structure. And that's verse 5 and verse 6 have the same last line, but said differently. Verse 5, may God fulfill all your plans. V'chol atzatcha yimale. Verse 6 is, Yimale Adonai kol mishalotecha. May Yud He Vav He fulfill all of your requests, all of your counsels, which in the later I will translate as all your requests. Remarkably, Robert Alter, who is an admired Bible translator, a professor of literature at Berkeley, he will say that it's possible that this repetition, because they are the same meaning of the last lines of 5 and 6, could be due to scribal error. That's possible, but I believe it's unlikely. What I have found in this close reading of Psalms, which again has been at the center of Jewish prayer and Christian prayer, is that everything is purposeful. And in that light, I see it as the center, and that is, it's repeated for emphasis. May all your desires be fulfilled. May all your plans be fulfilled by God, because that is the key thrust here. May all your desires be fulfilled. In fact, that's what I'm going to rename this psalm. May all your desires be fulfilled. With that, I'm going to give a little bit more room today for any reactions. I do have other comments I can make, but I wanted to, in light of talking so fast and so much yesterday about Psalm 19, to be a little airier today. So, questions, or is there one of these lines that you hold on to as meaningful to you? Please share. Julia? And then Mimi?
I was interested in how this could be read as a prayer for women in labor, because it feels very military. And so, like, is the line deliver, does that have that same, the word deliver have that same sense of redemption and delivering a baby? Is there any, can you just talk a little bit more about that tradition?
So I don't know much about the tradition. I have seen it cited in my traditional commentaries as a use. And so in the Art Scroll, they have that in the introduction, because they often try to link what the psalm is relevant for. And then in my research, I saw that it was noted in the Zohar as 70 cries of labor. And so Zohar plays out, ripples into folk practice. But all of it and all of Psalms, and this is something again to hold on to, are viewed in this. Already the Talmud would say that the Psalms are to be read in a multi-layered way, that they can be read as words of David and they can be read as our words. And this is about, like the opening, may Adonai answer you in a day of distress. May you find safety with the name of the God of Jacob. So I'm gonna see, I'm already translating. And so that notion that what is being prayed for is somebody in distress who needs safety. Yes, it probably in its origin around kings dealt with military threats, but can be made more broadly. And regarding all the Psalms and all the enemies, a classic Hasidic vein of commentary is that the enemy is always within us. our only Yetzer Hara. This is not focused on the woman in distress. It's viewed on how you can view distress in even broader ways. So may we, in our own inner turmoils, our own inner struggles, find support. And that image, as we're seeing, is constantly repeated. May we not stumble. May we stand firmly. And so in the Hasidic way, which psychologizes all enemies, this can also be about our inner life. But what I find where I started with my singing of Dylan is that this is prayerful in ways that the others were not as directly a prayer. And that's distinctive to Psalm 20. I had Mimi, and then I see Vivian. No? Vivian? No?
Ellie?
Yes?
Hi, it's Hal.
Oh, Hal. Go ahead, Hal.
Yeah, I see there seems a big change in this psalm, especially in the first 5 stanzas. Much more intimate connection between God and me, a really personal connection, which I think differs from the more impersonal and distant connection between God and us in a more universal in previous psalms. Also, there's a whole bunch of pronouns here: I, me, you, they, floating around in these lines.
Yes. So let me amplify Hal's insight. One is that there's a lot of pronouns in this psalm. And as we've returned repeatedly in Hebrew, we don't know, there's no capitalization of pronouns. So we're always left to ask, who's the you? We're going to see that even more profoundly tomorrow in Psalm 21, where the second half, some say is a human voice, the you is human, some say God. 2 different readings of the same psalm with many on both sides. So that's the first part to emphasize that Hal notes. Lots of pronouns, and with that a quality of some ambiguity. And at the same time, the first half in particular of this psalm has an address to God. May God grant you heart. Now, so there's an immediacy. May God, it's prayerful. Whenever we give a blessing to somebody, we begin the same way. May God grant you, and then you fill in the blank. But that's the mode of prayer. It's as if God is immediate. So it's not being said to the person, may God grant you. It's may God remember all your, it's a blessing. You're saying it for the person to overhear your words, heartfelt, to God who is before you. That's what makes it prayer. And that's why I started with the Dylan lines, because I also want to emphasize that prayer is universal as a need to express our deepest yearnings in a way that transcends us. Other comments or reactions? So if there, I don't see any hand. Vivian? This time you got to unmute yourself, Vivian. I'll unmute you, or.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Vivian.
I was interested in the chat comment someone made about.
Which comment?
A chat comment, a comment on the chat line.
Yes.
About the plans of Saul. I was interested in that comment. I beg your pardon if it's not clear. Maybe the person would repeat it.
The chat comment states, may God fulfill your every plan, including killing the children of Saul and other internal enemies. This came from Arnold Sugarman.
So let me respond, Arnold, to this. The question, let me reframe it, is what moment of David's life might this have been written about? And who are the enemies that are threatening him that would seek to be destroyed? And we're left to speculate. Here's, whenever Rashi speculates, it's worth taking note because he's such an influential commentator. He says this prayer is when David had to stay behind in battle, which is the second book of Samuel, chapter 18. His general Yoav was going into battle, and he was older. This is toward the end of his life. He was told, stay behind and pray for us. And so David stayed behind, and the Talmud will say in Sanhedrin 49a, if not for the merit of David, Yoav could not have been successful in war, which is to say, the later rabbis will see that General Yoav's success against the Philistines was due to David's merit and David's prayer, and Rashi links it specifically to Psalm 20. In reference to Arnold Sugarman's question, David will have many battles, and some of them will be very messy, mass slayings, including battles against Saul's supporters as he assumes power. There's a bit of a civil war. That's early in his career. For Rashi, this occurs toward the end of his career, but we really don't know when it was written. So some closing things about this prayer. It's actually recited every day as part of the morning prayers, except on Shabbat. In that sense, it's a more important prayer. It's more prayerful. It's toward the end of Shacharit, right after the Ashrei. Verse 10, that concluding verse, is, as I noted earlier, the second line of our evening prayers every night, part of Ma'ariv. It's repeated twice in the introductory prayers of Psukei de Zimra. And last, when I looked up this prayer, I found in terms of Chabad, when do they recommend the saying of this prayer? Having noted that women say it popularly, they say it's for anybody in distress. That this psalm specifically and Psalm 119, just those two psalms, are prayers of distress. May God be there in your distress, because that's how it opens. In that regard, the word Sarah, Ya'ancha Adonai, may Yud Hey Vav Hey answer you b'yom tzara, on the day of your stress. Many of you know the Yiddish word tsuris. Tsuris means troubles and problems. It comes from this Hebrew word. It means its root is a narrow place. When you feel like you are in a rut, that is distress. That's how it feels always. You always feel boxed in by a situation. That's the root of tsara. So some people translate it as in the day of your trouble. I chose distress because I wanted to have a little bit more of the tension in it, but it's a word that reappears in Psalms and worth knowing of. It's the same word for Mitzrayim, because Egypt is a narrow place, largely physically because it's along the Nile. In that sense, it's narrow in its geography or demography. But the rabbis will see Mitzrayim, back to the psychologizing of the Passover story, as it's not only a tale of physical redemption, but a redemption when we see ourselves in our own ruts, our own narrow places. May we find liberation and emerging toward freedom. Ya'ancha Adonai b'yom tzara, may God answer you in the day of your tzuras. And that is the focus of Psalm 20. Tomorrow, Psalm 21, it's not unlike Psalm 20 in length. It's not as complex and rich in some ways as Psalm 19, but there's this fascinating ambiguity in the second half over who is the you. Is the you in terms of fighting one's enemies, God who is victorious, or the king, or is it the partnership because of that ambiguity between the two? So I look forward tomorrow to Psalm 21. And I've already begun to prepare Psalm 23 for next week and Psalm 22 in honor of all of us, but knowing it's one of Riva's favorites. So thank you. Have a good day.